It's the year ending 31st of December 2019, and this is the Year Unwrapped. Oh yes, it's a festive special. In the past 12 months, we've seen another UK general election, the impeachment of President Trump, Greta Thunberg leading the global climate strike, devastating terrorist attacks in Sri Lanka, and same-sex marriage legalised in Austria. But we're here to bring you some of the trends that passed under the radar this year. The big changes that are slowly affecting the way we live our lives. I'm Olly Mann, and let's unwrap the year. And joining me today from the Week's digital team are the boss man Holden Frith and deputy boss man Arion McNicoll, and from the Week's US sister site, theweek.com, it's Jessica Hullinger. And don't worry, we did record this before Christmas, if you can identify that my sore throat remains from last week. However, this is not a clip show. This is all new content for you, because we're going to look back at the underreported significant stories of the year. And starting the show this week is Holden. What do you think this week, this year, should be remembered for?
After not just a year, but a decade of gloom, it's time for a war on pessimism.
In the course of 4 years, we made 300,000 airplanes, we made all the bullets, all the guns, not just for the American war effort, but for all of the Allies. So you need an effort that big, and with an effort that big, you could turn it around and actually hit that as close to that 1.5 degree target as we can get. But it needs that kind of wartime mentality and wartime effort.
Entrepreneur Saul Griffith speaking on the Ezra Klein Show, available wherever you get your podcasts. Holden, he's talking about climate change, I guess. What's the story?
The story is that 2019 will be the first year in which Britain generated more electricity from renewable sources than from fossil fuels.
Really?
And in the second half of the year, you can even leave nuclear out of the equation. So we got more power from wind, solar, hydro and biomass than we did from coal, oil and gas.
Wow, that has been underreported. So can Extinction Rebellion go home then? Has it all been solved?
Yep, absolutely. Merry Christmas. Or Happy New Year, given that we're recording when we are. Clearly there's still huge problems, huge challenge here still to be met. But the reason I think this qualifies as an underreported story for the year with significance, even though we have been talking a lot about climate change this year, is that all the attention really has been on the negative side of the story. So it's been about apocalyptic visions of what will happen if we don't make these changes, or about the fact that politicians aren't really acting in the way that we need them to, or even about disputes between different groups proposing different solutions. And I think what that tends to mean is that all of the people we hear for are telling us how hard this is going to be. And that tends to lead to apathy rather than urgency. And what Saul Griffith is saying is that we do know what we have to do. We can do it. And in fact, in a lot of cases, we are doing it. We just need to do it more quickly and in more places.
I mean, I have actually noticed that some of the energy companies, their advertising this year has been focused around their green credentials. But it slightly washes over me, that stuff. I almost don't listen because I think it's spin. I'm actually surprised to hear the statistic really is that we've shifted to renewable energy.
Yeah, and it's borne out internationally as well, not quite as profoundly as within the UK, but 1/3 of global installed power capacity is now renewable worldwide. So we really are seeing this really interesting and profound shift around the world. But the problem is, and maybe the reason why this continues to be underreported, is that electricity still only makes up part of our energy consumption. And the reality is that it's not even the largest part.
So burning petrol doesn't count in these statistics?
Well, exactly. And so both heating and cooling and transport are still massively dominated by fossil fuels.
And Jess, taking your patch for a moment, I mean, we were saying on the show a couple of weeks ago that I think the US is now the biggest global producer of oil thanks to fracking. So, you know, if you look at this internationally, which you have to with the climate, don't you? It is a very minor story, really.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think it can be denied that this is a huge problem still. And, I totally take Holden's point about, wanting to take a positive spin on it. And I think that it makes a lot of sense because we each individually feel like there's very little that we can do. And you're right, it does lead to apathy when we look at this in a global context. So I think pointing out the good stuff is helpful. But yeah, I mean, the world's carbon pollution from fossil fuels actually rose this year overall, reaching a record high. The good news is that it is slowing, right? So historically, according to the Global Carbon Project, when global GDP rises, pollution from fossil fuels also rises. However, this year, global GDP has continued to rise, but carbon pollution has slowed. And so if you look at that in a historical context, that's actually quite good news.
My take on it would not necessarily be so much that we have to be optimistic, although I don't think that would hurt, but it's more that there's a kind of pessimism that can sink in around the table when you start recounting all of the statistics here, however accurate and terrifying they may be. And I think the reason that the comparison with the war effort of the Second World War is useful is that in 1939 and 1940, you easily could have sat around a table and had a similar conversation about how difficult it would be to make 300,000 aircraft over 4 years. And yet it just happened because it had to.
But to extend your comparison to an extent that might make you uncomfortable, who's the Churchill in this scenario?
I don't think we have the equivalent of a Churchill yet. And I think part of the problem is that the debate has become quite factionalized and tends to be framed in quite a frustrating way, where you get one group of people saying we have to abandon the modern economy entirely and go back to a pre-industrial society, and another group of people who will say, well, everything's basically fine, and if we just reuse plastic bags, then we can continue on without changing our lives. We need Greta Thunberg. We need Jeremy Clarkson changing his mind. We need Elon Musk. We need all of these people. We need engineers rather than politicians taking a lead.
And the other thing with a wartime comparison is that one of the things that motivates people is propaganda, isn't it? And if all we're seeing at the moment is the bad guy, climate change, maybe we should, in the media, have a bit more responsibility for reporting the good news stories as a way of motivating people to do more. Not to say it's enough.
I think that's really true. And I think that it is really important to highlight in particular the way renewable technologies just get cheaper and cheaper every year. But I think that one thing that I'd want to pick up on with what you just said, Holden, was this idea that we need engineers and not politicians. I think we need both, really, because it is those good supportive policies, both nationally and internationally, that have helped spur the kind of investment in and development of renewable energy that has turned into this good news story now. Yeah. And I think we often get that sort of quasi-libertarian argument being mounted for renewables, that we just need to wait until they get affordable enough and then the market will sort it out. But in fact, we continue to need good policy driving this.
Yeah, I fell into my own trap, really, of talking about the debate in terms of one group against another, when you're right, it has to be all-encompassing. And we do need either a politician or a visionary or a collection of them to paint the optimistic picture of what a carbon-free economy looks like. And it could be, limitless, very cheap energy that will completely reframe the way we live our lives.
Jess, do you see any cause for optimism, especially in the US?
Yeah, I do. I mean, you mentioned the U.S. The U.S. is a huge offender, but the United States is also the second largest market for solar energy. You see the trend of Seoul collapsing in the U.S. and, of course, in Europe as well. The amount of power generated by coal in the U.S. has halved since 2005. Yeah, I mean, I think there is cause for optimism. I
suppose the mainstreaming as well of, I guess, anti-climate destroying policies is something that we're seeing. We saw in the UK general election, both Labour and the Liberal Democrats had policies in their manifestos that would penalise people for flying more than a certain amount per year. So you'd be able to go on your family holiday once or twice. If you were taking 20 business trips, you'd be paying ever-increasing amounts of taxes. And obviously, they didn't win the general election, but they're our second and fourth largest political party. So that's obviously kind of slowly creeping into the mainstream.
It is. You're talking about a gap in the market for somebody to step forward and, become the figurehead for a green infrastructure project. I see no reason why that couldn't be Boris Johnson. He loves big, shiny infrastructure projects. Not all of them so far have been green, but if he wanted to make a mark, I don't think it's politically impossible that a Conservative leader could become the person to drive that forward here. And, especially if Britain's looking for a post-Brexit role in the world, then this seems like a perfect fit.
And I guess it actually, from that point of view, takes away some of his opponent's policies, doesn't it? It's yet another thing where he can be a chameleon and say, oh, well, we're going to do that too.
Politically, it would also be a great story for him to tell if he could reinvent the post-industrial areas that he has won this election on the back of as areas of green energy generation.
But there is the climate movement stuff. You know, there is Extinction Rebellion, there is Greta Thunberg. This year, it felt to me generally like most people thought it was quite refreshing, that it was a way of getting that story into the sort of general discussion. It's beginning to piss people off, isn't it? When it means they can't go on their summer holiday, when it means that they can't get to work for the fifth time, it might tip, mightn't it?
Yeah, it felt like Extinction Rebellion had a sort of classic tabloid-esque trajectory where first they were built up in the way that a new celebrity like your Meghan Markles might be when they emerge on the scene, and then they were immediately torn down. And there was this sort of broad enthusiasm, it felt, when the Extinction Rebellion, at least here in London, had blocked off some bridges and were in a kind of summertime party mode. And then that did feel like it switched when the weather got gloomier and some people had glued themselves to a train, and then people weren't able to finish their commute, and you did sort of have a feeling that, at least in London and those actions, that there was a bit of a turning against Extinction Rebellion. But I think they've still put themselves on the map in a way that is interesting and useful. And I don't know that people are at the point of that they've had their tolerance for Extinction Rebellion's message completely exhausted.
So if we're looking forward to 2020, though, do we think that the future of the climate movement is going to be positive or negative? I mean, it's one thing saying it would be nice if it was positive. What do we actually think it's going to be?
I think it's going to get harder before it gets easier. I think there's going to be more conflict and agitation before it becomes more peaceful and optimistic. I think it's too big of a problem to say that it's just going to be smooth sailing and that everybody's going to jump on the bandwagon. Because if you think about it, with Extinction Rebellion and various other movements, I get what they're doing and I understand that it's meant to wake people up. But again, it's more than at the personal level. Like, you and I can only do so much as individuals. It has to be at a political, legislative level. And yeah, a lot of people can afford to go out and march in the middle of the day, but a lot of us can't. A lot of us simply don't have the ability to do that. And so I think, there's an inherent contradiction there. And I don't know what the average person will be able to do. So I think it is going to become a little bit more difficult, but again, before it gets easier. But I think that that's inherent in any movement.
Holden.
I wouldn't be surprised if you were correct, Jess. I think there's conflict still to come. But I think what Saul Griffith would say was that's partly because we haven't been given the positives to aim for. We still see the environmental movement as something that involves deprivation of things we have to give up. We haven't been given that positive view of what we can look forward to once we get through this period of transition.
Okay, well, here's something you can look forward to. Arion is up next after this. Okay, Arion, your turn. What do you think this year will be remembered for?
Well, bye-bye 2019, a year that was all bye.
It was another record-setting day on Wall Street. The Dow, the S&P, the NASDAQ, all, you might have guessed it, at all-time highs. Let me tell you how math works, Guy.
Go.
Every time the market goes up, if you're at an all-time high, that would be what?
A new high.
Correct. Our Bob Pisani joining us live from the New York Stock Exchange with more. Break it all down, make some sense, rein it in for us, Bob.
Nobody's getting past you, Brian. Stocks were back in record rally mode today. He's right. The Dow, S&P 500, NASDAQ all closing at new highs once again, though barely. Now, this marks the 30th record close of the year for the S&P 500.
A clip from CNBC Television's post-market show, Fast Money. Arion, we're going to do some slow money now.
Yes.
Bit less bro vibes.
Yeah.
Tell us why and what is your story of 2019?
Well, yeah, Jess, I'm afraid that we don't tend to have the same sort of enthusiasm that your people can muster for something as dry as economic type stories. But the story that I wanted to talk about this year is the fact that 2019 is shaping up to be one of the best ever for investors, with nearly every single asset class you could care to name set to finish in the green. We're not quite there yet, but it looks likely that it's headed in that trajectory. So that means whether you invested in stocks or government debt or corporate bonds or commodities, wherever you went, you were likely to make a profit this year.
And is that just in the States? Because it's about the S&P 500, isn't it, which is a US-based investment structure?
It's not just in the States, though. The article that I was looking at initially when I saw this story, which came from CNBC, was focusing on stuff in the States, but actually similar sorts of trajectories are being seen with the FTSE, same with Asian indexes, the Nikkei and the Hang Seng. So you're kind of seeing this broad global growth, looking at things that are international, like gold, like oil, those have also risen. Even kind of lesser known commodities, copper, soybeans, oats and sugar, they've all risen this year.
Jess, I keep hearing that there's a recession on the way. So what's this?
Yeah, I mean, I think that you have to look at interest rates, right? I mean, interest rates are historically low, and particularly in the U.S. this year, they've lowered them 3 times. And so I think that's one of the reasons for optimism and why especially the stock market has been doing so well.
And I guess that's the thing, isn't it? If you're listening to this and thinking, well, that's interesting, but I don't invest in the stock markets, as we've discussed on this show before, you probably do. You probably do without realizing it because your bank account will be tied to it or your pension.
That's right. And also, if recession does hit, as Jess was saying, it looks as though we've dodged that recessionary moment that emerged sort of in the spring or summer where yield curves inverted. And if you want more about that, you can go to episode 129 where we discussed that with John Stepek, who actually knows about these things.
He's here in spirit.
Yeah.
Say yield curves invert and it's like summoning his ghost.
Yeah. But as he was explaining, that basically means that you were paying for the opportunity to take on government debt, which is kind of unusual. But why it was interesting then, was that it usually prefigures recessions, and that doesn't look like it's come to pass. And it looks as though perhaps the recession that was anticipated in the US sometime late 2019 or into 2020 isn't going to emerge. It could happen further down the line.
But bold prediction from you now. You're saying that there's no recession this year.
Well, given we've only got a few days left,
no, I
sure.
mean 2020, you know what I mean.
Well, also, I mean, the economy is in America doing really, really well. I mean, ask President Trump, he'll tell you that the economy is doing really, really well.
And is it fair enough that he takes the credit for that, by the way? Because as we've just said, this appears to be the case globally.
No, the economy was set up to do well in Obama's years, and actually it did better during Obama's years. So it's well recognized that a lot of the credit actually goes to Obama, and Trump has sort of inherited it.
And part of the reason why the economy is going well at the end of 2019 in the US is because it looks as though the trade war that Trump initiated is kind of being resolved. And so whether he can take credit for solving something that he also began himself,
it's also worth drawing a bit of a distinction between the real economy and then the markets, because most of these indicators are about markets and other assets.
John Stepek would be steaming at the ears at this. But go on. Delineate for us the difference between the world he's in and real life.
There is a connection between them, because the share price of an individual company should be a reflection of the health of that company, but it also has a portion of prediction about where that company is going, and sort of the hopes and fears and the greed and fear of investors are all kind of tied up in that.
And on the Brexit point, actually, now that we know that we are leaving the EU in 4 weeks' time, in terms of the markets, is it actually a good time to do that financially? Or will the economic hit be unaffected by the current state of the market?
I think there's probably not that much of an effect, because we move out of the EU into the transition period and nothing changes during that point. And because we've had such
Sound like Theresa May.
Nothing has changed. Because we've had such a long period of uncertainty and a long transition into the transition period, I think it will be business as usual until we get a clearer sense of what the end point is, the final trade agreement with the EU at the end of 2020.
But the funny thing about markets is that they really hate uncertainty more than anything else. And as Holden and I were talking about a couple of days ago, it's curious that on the point of Brexit, initially the markets reacted very firmly against it because it was a destabilising force in itself. But the UK's inability to pull Brexit off has been the sort of destabilizing thing that the nation has faced subsequently. And so actually now that's sort of flipped, and you're getting this weird case where actually to pull Brexit off and do it finally is the thing that the markets are reacting to positively.
And Jess, if you're right that it's about low interest rates, could they get lower? Could it be beneficial if it did? Trump has been tweeting his support for that, for interest costs being brought way down to zero?
Right, yeah. I mean, that is ridiculous. So historical data actually shows that 3 is sort of the magic number when it comes to lowering interest rates in the States. So historical data show that when the third interest rate cut is the last in the series, so when interest rates don't go any lower, the following year stocks get a nice boost. And actually, you don't want to lower interest rates any further because it's sort of like the last tool you have in your toolbox, and the more you use it, the less effective it becomes. So if the economy tanks, like your most powerful weapon is no longer very powerful. And there's no indication actually that the Fed is going to lower interest rates. They're very happy with how the economy is growing. Right now, the indication is that they're going to keep things steady.
And you chose this as your story of the year. Was it a surprise to you, Arion, this story? As in, if I'd been able to play you this episode 11 months ahead of time back in January 2019, would you say, oh, that's a shock, no one saw that coming? It's worked out well for investments.
Yeah, I think that the thing that this story rests on is the removal of those 2 political uncertainties. And I don't know that I would have been surprised that there'd been resolution by the end of the year on the Brexit question, or that moves had been made to end the trade war. But the fact that they have done, and the impact that it's had on markets subsequently, as well as a whole lot of other factors, I think is quite surprising. And it felt as though the year's financial reporting was telling stories of doom and gloom, and particularly focused on that moment where recession looked likely. And so for us to be here now feels unlikely.
This is quite nice, isn't it? That's 2 stories in a row where we've been like, guys, it's not as bad as you think.
Well, actually, one of the scenarios I read about in researching this subject was one of the biggest fears for the market next year is that things go too well. That actually, because interest rates are so low, and because there's been such a program of stimulus across Europe and the States, that there's a chance that this all takes off. And that sounds like a good thing, and in the short term it would be. But you would then get inflation really taking off, which would mean interest rates would have to jump up. And that's when that really starts to hit individuals in their pocket, because any debts they have, including mortgages, start to get a lot more expensive.
Okay, thanks for that pathos chaser there, Holden. Right, Jessica, IEI will always love your story. And that's up next. And finally this week, I'm so excited for this. Jessica, what do you think, implausibly, this year will be remembered for?
2019 was the year of the Dolly Renaissance.
America from a Dolly's eye view is this quivering mass of irreconcilable contradictions.
I'm going to be both. I'm going to be adored by church ladies and the gays.
Yeah, the sexuality, the spirituality, the sensuality. That's exactly who I am.
She's just a beautiful fountain of goodness.
It's me.
The trailer for the WNYC podcast, Dolly Parton's America, which I haven't listened to yet, but as you're listening to this right now, I am binge listening to over Christmas. Jessica, 2019, the year of Dolly Parton, that's your hypothesis.
Yeah, totally.
Give it to me.
Okay, yeah. So this artist, the 73-year-old artist, perhaps the most popular country music artist ever, she's had a 50-year career. 2019 is her year. This is especially true in the States. As someone who is very plugged into what's happening in America, she has been all over my various social media feeds. She's been at the top of headlines. She is having a moment, and she's seeing a huge resurgence, and particularly among young people. She's managed to capture the attention of young people, which is really, really interesting, given that she hasn't actually put out much new music lately.
Okay, so what has she done for those that have missed?
So Dolly is, like you said, the subject of a really interesting podcast, sort of chronicling her life and her career, and really talking about and exploring the reasons why she represents America. The podcast is called Dolly Parton's America, and it's all about why she remains so popular and how she has fans that cross all lines, right? So she has fans in the South. She is a champion for women's rights. She has a huge fan base in the gay community. Conservatives love her. Liberals
okay, but is it
love
just
her.
the podcast? What else is there?
Right. So she's also the inspiration for a new Netflix series.
Oh, yeah, the Hot
Heartstrings.
Yeah.
Yep. She's been featured in an EDM song. She is like really incredibly popular on social media. There's talk of her replacing a Confederate monument in Tennessee.
I mean, do you buy into that thesis that Dolly Parton says a lot about America? I mean, because I'm sure she does, but so does Elvis Presley, so does Michael Jackson. Why Dolly Parton?
I think because actually she doesn't say much of anything. One of the reasons why she remains so popular is because she has refused to participate in politics. I think probably that's a huge business decision, and it's paid off very well because, like I said, she has fans everywhere and she doesn't want to alienate any of them. But I also think that while it's calculated, it's not a decision a lot of artists make. And I think that actually it's united more people than it has divided. And I think that actually says a lot about her and a lot about maybe what's needed.
Arion, you were nodding fervently when Jess was talking about Dolly's aversion to politics there.
Yeah, well, it's fascinating. I've only just started listening to the podcast series, but it really focuses on this particular gathering of people coming to a live show, and especially at the beginning,
I love this.
Yeah, and bring the coming together of evangelicals and drag queens and country fans and young people, old people, absolutely everything. And in that sense, the podcast's thesis is Dolly Parton is this sort of rallying point for contemporary America. But it is fascinating as well what Jess was saying about how Dolly Parton herself rejects the term or rejects the idea of her being these things. She calls herself not Republican, not Democrat, but a hypocrite. And she says, when asked specifically if she is feminist, she says, I'm not feminist and I love men. And so she's sort of rejecting the terms on which this podcaster is trying to come to her.
That feminism point's really interesting, isn't it, Holden? Because you kind of think if a young female country artist gave that exact same answer, no, I'm not a feminist and I love men, that might be a cause for young women not to feel a connection with her music. But with Dolly, because she can kind of be all things to all people, she's been around for so long, she's so self-evidently a powerful female icon, she sails through that.
Yeah, she's lived the life and she's become, I don't know if in the States you talk about national treasures in the same way, but the idea of being someone who has such a reputation and is so well loved or so little hated that they can say and do almost anything and they get a kind of indulgent smile. But I think the Dolly Parton on the feminism point is particularly interesting because although she explicitly rejects it the first time around, the presenter is obviously slightly troubled by this, and that's not the answer he wanted, and nor a lot of the contributors. And they all try and find ways of making allowances for her and making excuses for her and saying, well, she comes from this background, she has this. But they come back to her at the end and the presenter sort of suggests, well, there's this idea of being a feminist in practice. And she immediately goes for it and says, yes, that's me. I live the life. And I think, there's an element of truth to that. She has lived the life. She's kept hold of all of her publishing royalties. She didn't let Elvis Presley record I Will Always Love You because his manager wanted a cut of the publishing rights. And not many artists of her era have managed that kind of business decision.
And the trick that she pulled off as well, Jess, which is less significant these days, but probably really important in the 70s and 80s in particular, was she was playing up this dumb blonde image, although she famously said, I ain't dumb and I ain't blonde. But I mean, the whole point was, it's all about the boobs, basically, isn't it? It's all about my silly hair. Don't take me too seriously. And underneath it, clearly, always a very shrewd businesswoman with a clear understanding of what her brand was.
Absolutely. I think she's a genius in that sense. She uses what she knows will be seen as a joke to her benefit, and she uses it to disarm people and to rise. I think it's really, really smart. And I mean, yeah, I think also a lot of people, feminists, a certain stream of feminists in particular, will look at that and say, well, that's anti-feminist and that's doing harm. But I mean, you look at her success and how can you argue with her strategy?
It's also the rags to riches thing as well, isn't it? I mean, she genuinely has a story of abject poverty, sharing a bed with, I think it was 11 siblings, in Tennessee.
I think particularly in America, that message really rings true because America's all about rising from nothing, right? Making something out of yourself out of nothing. And she can say truly that she has done that.
Mm.
And I think the lyrics of her songs, and one of the other interesting aspects of the podcast is the way that they're one of the early people that they consult, an author called Helen Morales, who wrote a book called Pilgrimage to Dollywood. And she said, you've really got to look at Dolly and talk about Dolly in terms of her lyrics. You know, there are so many other country and western singers like Johnny Cash and Hank Williams who have had their lyrical output analysed in the way that it deserves, but Dolly Parton really hasn't. And when you look back at the stories that she's writing, particularly in those early days, they tell a really true and honest depiction of what particularly her early life was, but it evidently resonated with America more broadly. And I think it resonates internationally. That's why she's popular.
I wonder as well, Holden, whether this was the year that finally irony took a bit of a back seat. I mean, it probably doesn't apply in America, where obviously country music is a massive genre. But in the UK, I mean, I've always loved country music. I've always liked Dolly Parton. But I probably wouldn't have said that when I was at university because it wasn't cool, even though the songs always were great. The songs always were great. And you think about Queen, for example, take a rock example, similar sort of thing. It's got to the stage now where people are prepared to analyse stuff on its own terms as, yeah, that's a great song, without having to say, but it's a bit cheesy.
And I think she personally has benefited from that as well. And I think part of the reason she is so popular is that she clearly loves being who she is, or at least she gives a very convincing portrayal of someone who loves being who she is. And I think with her, it's always a little bit difficult to tell what's artifice and what's real. You know, that is what Dolly Parton is. It's that mixture of the two. But I think whereas a lot of artists, even successful ones, end up resenting their fans either out of a sort of sense of coolness or that they're above them, or just because of the inconvenience of fame, Dolly Parton seems to love it. She just, from listening to the podcast, she just seems like really good company. And I haven't really been a fan of hers up until now, but I'm well on the way to being a convert.
Just a brief Dolly Parton anecdote of my own. I've never been able to tell this in a public forum before, but this seems like the perfect opportunity. I went to see her launch her book project. You know, she does this thing in the US where she subsidises books for primary schools so that everyone can get a good start and read. And again, probably slightly less relevant here in the UK, where there already are charities doing that kind of thing, and the state school system and everything. Nonetheless, she launched it over here. And I went to the launch. It was at the Savoy Hotel in London. And the day before, she'd been launching it up north. And she came out on stage in front of a room full of journalists and said, "Hello, Manchester." And because she's Dolly Parton, when the room laughed, she just did the cold kind of ditzy, "Oh, have I got that wrong? Oh, I'm in London." And it looked almost scripted, which it obviously wasn't. But you just think, wow, that is just the perfectly constructed personality to get you through anything.
Yeah. One of my favourite Dolly Parton quotes was, people thought the joke was on me, but actually it was on them. I just think that says so much about this big, larger-than-life character who actually represents much more about the people listening to her than herself.
Well, that is it from this edition of the Year Unwrapped. What a way to make a living. My thanks to Arion McNicoll, Jessica Hullinger and Holden Frith. And as Dolly Parton famously sang, I wish you all joy and happiness, but above all this, I wish you love. Never miss an episode when you subscribe to this podcast. Just search for The Week Unwrapped on your app of choice and hit subscribe. I don't remember Dolly singing that one. I've been Olly Mann. Our music is by Tom Morby, the producer Sarah Miles. Rethink Audio. And until we meet again to unwrap next week, we will be back in 2020. Bye-bye.